again for coming.
No, thanks. Thank you, Steve. Firstly, like everyone, massive thank you to you, Steve, and to Playermaker. Obviously, we're going through an interesting time at the moment. I think it's fantastic how our community has come together and within the space of maybe 2 weeks put on this event. And a big thank you to you guys for making it happen and working so seamlessly through this. So my cheesy X Factor journey to start with, and I think this highlights that I've been really lucky to have experiences working in different sports, different countries. And so my presentation today is a little bit different from some of the others we've seen. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of what we collect, what we do, but I'm going to talk about some of the differences that I've experienced changing between sports, some of the challenges that provides. And I'd like to encourage everyone watching to reflect perhaps on these kinds of experiences and what that would mean for them if they were to change sports. Because I often get asked about how to get into a certain sport or how to get into America or working in a different country, which, to be honest, I have achieved, I think, more through luck than anything. But it's not as straightforward as it seems. And I think people often envisage picking up the systems and processes that they do in their current sport or team, and just dropping that into a new environment. And there's many reasons why that necessarily perhaps won't work. And even if you're not looking to change sports or don't manage to change sports, I think even within the sports themselves, when I was working in soccer, I will call it soccer just for clarity, given that I'm talking about a number of football codes here, but I experienced, a bit like Grant was just talking about, working in both the first team and academy football. I also went from the Premier League team to a championship team. So again, changing environments is a big challenge. And that's what I'm going to highlight, some of the differences, hopefully, in this presentation. I'm sure many of you are aware of this Dunning-Kruger effect. So as we're starting out in our careers, come out of university, brewing with confidence, despite the fact we have very low experience. And the more we learn, the more we realise we don't know. And that can affect our confidence, which hopefully at some point we reach a tipping point where that starts to grow again. And I can tell you now that changing sports will rapidly speed up this coming down from this peak here as you question what you do and what you know. So let's get into how we go about changing with those environments. And I really like this quote, which kind of follows on from the Dunning-Kruger effect, because yes, studying and reading can give us knowledge, but really to acquire wisdom, we have to observe. And so I'll start off with a bird's eye view of each sport, firstly looking at the annual schedule. And we'll start with American football here. So it seems to be predominantly a soccer environment, I've noticed throughout the day today. So this, I'm going to go through it quite basically. So for any American audience, this might be quite obvious, but if we start with where we're at now, in March, we're in the off season. And in a normal year, obviously different situation right now, mid-April to mid-June, we would have what's known as the off-season program. So obviously you can see here between February and July, there's quite a significant off-season period for the players. And therefore we have these 2 months in the middle of that where there are optional activities for the players to come in and train. And we'll get into the specifics of that in a bit. Then they break away again for 5 weeks, end of June, early July, come back for pre-season at the end of July. And after a couple of weeks, we start 1 game a week. And then the season will start the beginning of September, run through to the end of December, which will be the regular season. And as you see, we play one game a week. We may have a Thursday night game, Monday night game. Predominantly the games are Sundays. We get one bye week in that time. Then if you make the playoffs, they run through one game a week in January. And then ultimately the goal is to be playing on the Sunday of the first weekend in February, which is the Super Bowl. So for those not familiar, as I wasn't, with American team sports, they have these collective bargaining agreements set up. A collective bargaining agreement is a written contract between a trade union and the group that regulates the employment conditions for the workers. So it's not specific to sport, but these team sports work this way as well. So between the Players Association for the relevant sport and also obviously the league themselves. So the NFL actually had just agreed their new collective bargaining agreement because that was due to run out. I'm just going to take quickly, I mentioned about the off-season rules. This is publicly available on the NFLPA's website. And just to give you an idea of the strict limitations that are around at this time in particular. And again, it's not right or wrong, it's just what we're dealing with in terms of limitations of what happens on these dates, how long we can spend with the players, what the players can be doing in those times, whether it's just strength and conditioning, whether the coaches are allowed on the field, and then even down to the specifics of what kinds of drills they're allowed to do, how many of these sessions we're allowed, what the equipment involved is like, and again, more limitations around drills. So that's been a big learning curve in terms of decisions that in other sports may be completely up to the team, or maybe even up to the coaches and the performance staff completely, are dictated to us. So we have these, we have to acknowledge these rules and work within these rules. And just 2 weeks ago, perhaps, they agreed the new CBA for the next 11 years. And just to briefly point out things like mandatory 3 days off after a Thursday game, maximum number of hours at a team facility, again, more restrictions around equipment, again, all ideally for the benefit of the players, but it's important that we know we are working within these restrictions. So looking at hockey now, ice hockey, 82 game regular season, starts in September, runs till mid-April. Then if you make the playoffs, you're playing in May and June, best of 7 games series, and yeah, 3 to 4 games a week. A lot of travel involved, as we'll get into. So really other end of the spectrum in terms of game demands. And then perhaps the one most of us are most familiar with, sitting somewhere in between that, is the soccer season. So 2 games a week, much shorter off-season period. And so you are involved with your players much more around all year round compared to some of these other sports. So let's drill down into a microcycle then, and kind of a worst case scenario type example. So I think this is a couple of years ago actually now. This is a week from Chelsea, who had an away game in the Midlands, away game then in the Europa League, and then another away game up north in Liverpool. So that's probably about as bad as it gets. Obviously for the MLS, they're dealing with a lot more travel, but for Premier League soccer, that's maybe one of your worst weeks of the year. In hockey, of course, and in North America, this was a week from the Sabres a few years ago. So played away in New York, not too far to go from Buffalo. Then went to Dallas, and then straight on a road trip to Canada. So make sure you bring your passport, changing between time zones, playing back-to-back games. you have to travel the night before so that you arrive into the city the night before, even though this is after an evening game. So obviously a lot of travel to deal with in that week. And then in football, so again, a couple of years ago, the Bills had a trip to LA, and then the following week a trip to Kansas City. This year, we didn't have too bad demands. Our biggest trips were away in Dallas and then in Tennessee. But this coming year, how the fixtures rotate means that we've got away trips to Arizona, Denver, LA, and San Francisco to deal with. So what are we preparing them for? Obviously very sports specific. Soccer probably being the most well documented in terms of game demands, although it's important to acknowledge that we need more in the women's game for sure. And a lot of the challenges in this sport, you know, we've talked about today, or at least talked about in the literature in terms of fixture congestion, gaps from when players go on internationals and loans, between system differences in tracking systems, for example. So I feel like most people are comfortable with what soccer entails and some of the challenges we're facing. Moving on to hockey then. So as we can see here, hockey is characterized by high intensity intermittent skating, rapid changes in velocity and duration, frequent body contact. So each shift lasts 30 to 80 seconds. On average, it's about 45 seconds. And depending on how frequently you'll rotate on, it can be 4 to 5 minutes of recovery between shifts. So hockey's 3 times 20-minute periods with 17-minute intermissions in between, plus 3 2-minute TV timeouts per period. So obviously, particularly intermittent. And I know with soccer, obviously, we have our starters and our substitutes. So there is variation in minutes played. This is one game from the Stanley Cup Finals, Game 7, the decider. And this is pretty standard for a hockey game in the sense that your top guy will probably tally up about 28 minutes a night, can be 30, 32, compared to the bottom of your fourth line that may play 7 minutes, that could be even 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. So we see like really staggered variation in the time played in games, and obviously playing 3 games a week or so, that's compounding on top of each other. So you have real variation within the squad as to how much guys are playing. But of course, minutes alone isn't a great determinant of game demands. So thinking about quantifying mechanical load, and Chris Barnes's presentation from before was really interesting in terms of how we're starting to improve potentially capturing mechanical load in soccer. Well, we're still catching up with that in other sports. So what are some of the challenges of trying to do that now in these sports? That we also have the between system differences, and it tends to be perhaps an optical tracking system for games, along with inertial units for practice. But of course, we know that all of these tracking systems, the accuracy diminishes with increasing speed, with increasing movement complexity and change of direction, which obviously in hockey, with so much intense stop-starts in quite an enclosed space, can be an issue. Perhaps we can do some work looking at skating strides, and I know this is going on, trying to ascertain left and right. But again, obviously, we're dealing with inertial sensors that are placed on the upper body. So this is questionable at the minute. Obviously, being upper body location as well is limited in soccer, but with hockey being more of an upper body sport, it's interesting to see how that affects the data, and particularly you see spikes in the raw data caused by the intense motion of shooting. Now, is that spike a true measure of mechanical load? It's worth considering. Gliding. So the interesting thing about hockey, suddenly you're on ice rather than grass. So obviously everything is suddenly very different. And with being on ice, you can move location without perhaps putting mechanical load into that movement, or at least much energy into moving yourself. So how do we account for that? And I know work has been done to try and adjust the player load minimum bands to account for this gliding movement. Again, as we mentioned, it's very intermittent. So there's bench sitting is involved. So how do we account for all that time where you're not really doing anything except perhaps when you're celebrating a goal? Contact demands are great in this sport. So how are we trying to quantify that? And less so these days, but fighting is still a part of the game as well. And then, as per usual, goaltenders as well are a bit of a different scenario. So what are we doing to quantify their load? So moving on then to the demands of football. And if you're in Buffalo, this is the added demand at times, as we do suffer from some snow through the winter. But that aside, football involves repeated short maximum intensity bouts. And each playing position, as we'll discuss, has specific responsibilities that alter the physical demands, but predominantly taxing the anaerobic energy systems. So football is a 60-minute game that can take over 3 hours, has 4 quarters, and I think at least 16 commercial breaks within those. And someone worked out a number of years back that actually the ball is only in play about 11 minutes of the time. It's a fascinating sport to work in. And this was my cheat sheet when I first started working there, in the sense that your offense and defense are 2 completely separate teams. And if you are a backup, you will then play on special teams. So when we in soccer get used to reporting, for instance, okay, this training session or this drill on average for defenders, or even drilling down into centre backs, for example, that this elicits these demands. It's very hard to do that in this sport, given not just the variation with what players are being asked to do, but the fact that, for example, if you are a backup linebacker, you might then be on punt or kickoff, in which place your roles are then to sprint down the field. And obviously we have to prepare the players for that, but also for their role as a linebacker as well. So just to give an example here, we have a wide receiver, quarterback, and offensive lineman. And Aaron Wellman published some data using GPS data from Division I college football. And we can see, just using some of the velocity, distance data, great variation, as we would expect, in the demands across these positions, in the maximum speed, and then the maximum acceleration efforts as well. So these are all part of our team, and we're trying to prepare all these guys for what they need to do. Again, thinking about just our example for quantifying load, well, a challenge we're certainly faced with in this sport is the logistics piece. Pre-season training camp, we have 90 players, 90. It's quite staggering to see them line up and see the variation within the team, and the number of players that we're dealing with as well. And actually, Duncan French did a podcast, Steve Ingham's Supporting Champions podcast, not that long ago, and gave a really interesting perspective about how traditionally coaching in the US has had to stem from practicality and logistical basis because of the numbers that you're dealing with in these sports. And if you're working in a college team, there's even more players. So the squad gets cut down to 53 players in season, plus 10 practice squad guys who become almost like a reserve team. So first things first, with anything that we're trying to implement, whether it's screening, recovery, tracking loads, anything along these lines, logistics is an important consideration. Tackling and contact obviously is a big piece of the game, and I know work has been done in rugby in using these inertial sensors to quantify this. So the linemen, really interesting athletes, and obviously the previous slide really didn't do them justice in terms of the physical demands that we're dealing with for them. And some work has gone into algorithms, a bit like Chris was talking about. But still, a lot of the demands for these guys are isometric. So any kind of tracking technology for them may be underestimating the work that they have to do. Again, as I mentioned, on special teams, so these are guys from all kinds of positions, offense and defense, who are not starters. And then when they have to fulfill those roles on special teams, very different demands to what their day job is, if you like, what their primary position is. So how do we deal with that, both in terms of a preparation and a monitoring perspective? And then the specialists, so we have a punter, a kicker, and a long snapper, and that's their job. So how are we also supporting them from a scientific perspective? And then finally, so I talked a little bit about the off season now, with guys having many weeks away from us. I know Martin's did an editorial previously about whether the acute chronic ratio is worth the effort, given a number of reasons, some of which is the gaps, and certainly in these sports we deal with a lot of gaps, and there's a lot of player turnover in terms of picking up guys through the season who may just be training by themselves because there's no reserve teams really if you're not in a practice squad. So we do pick up guys just off the street who have been training, and obviously we don't know what their baseline loads are coming into us. So this is just some publicly available data that I put together in terms of seeing the variation in body composition. Again, obviously, football has a massive variation. So anything we're doing from a nutritional perspective, from a recovery perspective, we need to account for all of these body types. And then youth development, I think, is an important area. How are we getting these young players to us? In soccer, as most people are probably aware, they now even go into the team and do their schooling with the team and work their way through. In hockey, I mean, these kids, they start skating before they're walking a lot of the time. And then they end up going through either a college route or a junior hockey route. And then they can declare for the draft at 18. They do the scouting combine, which is all the testing, and then get drafted in the June of the year. And again, really young athletes, really varied backgrounds. Rasmus here is from Sweden. So again, we are dealing with international players in that sport. But different training histories is a big thing. And then sometimes they'll either get sent back out to their colleges, or there is a farm team system in the NHL. So you get guys younger, but then have a bit more control over their development. In football, obviously, big business in the country. The aim initially is to get a scholarship to play at college. Mostly they then do a few years of college before declaring themselves for the draft around 20, 21, 22. We do have some exceptions to that, but they tend to be older players than the hockey guys. And again, dealing with very vast differences in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of what they've been asked to do at the schools they were at, from a training perspective, even from a performance perspective. And so very different to soccer, where you can develop the player and keep tabs of them over a number of years. So context is everything, I think, when you're changing sport. And this is a really good article from Martin that I like to refer to, because, again, whether you're changing sports or changing environments, understanding the context of what you're coming into is so important. So with all that in mind, then just to change gears now and say, okay, well, what actually can we do then if we're going into a different environment? There's all those challenges. It may feel impossible to actually make a difference. What are the core things that we should be looking to assist with? Well, we know injuries are costly for many reasons. Obviously, it stops players from playing, but it can have physical, mental costs on them going forward, as well as financially and performance-wise for the team.
Jo,
Yeah.
sorry to just interrupt you there. And again, we'll carry on with your talk. I've just been informed by a couple of people that there's a clap for the NHS at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Which again, I was because I've been engrossed in this all day. Yeah, we're just gonna have so for the guys around the world. Basically, there is, and hopefully you guys can see my screen. Can you see my screen now, Jo?
Yeah.
So basically, at 8 o'clock in the UK, just to show our appreciation to all the people that have been working within the NHS and stuff like that, we've been asked to just stand up and give a round of applause. So we'll do like a 10-second bit of a round of applause. So I know it's not conventional, but we're not in conventional times, and really appreciate your understanding with this, Jo. So if everyone can join in, I'm going to be very quiet because my little boy's asleep next door. But again, I know this is unconventional, but we really do appreciate what the NHS are doing for us. And if this is what we can do to help and show our appreciation, then fantastic. So,
Touch, Steve.
Cheers, Warren. Thank you. Yeah. So sorry about that, Jo. I'll stop sharing my screen, but yeah, as it says, stay home, stay safe, and on behalf of everyone involved here, especially from within the UK, thank you to the NHS, and I'll leave you to carry on, Jo. Thank you for your understanding with that. If you can share screen again, Jo.
No worries. Very classy move there, Steve. I'm glad we could still be involved.
Yeah, exactly. So, sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. We're back on now, right?
Yeah, you're back on.
Yeah. Okay. That was handy actually because I had no idea about time either. So, yes. So, having established understanding context of the different sport or the sport or environment you're moving into, well, where may you want to try and make a difference? So we talked about, obviously, if we can reduce the cost of injury, and we're learning more and more about this in recent times, and this model from Bittencourt helps to highlight just how complex injuries are. Certainly a single screening test alone is not going to help us predict them, but if we start to understand more and more about injuries, perhaps we can make a difference to the sport in this sense. But it's not just all about wrapping our players in cotton wool and trying to protect them from injury either, because we actually know that well-developed physical capacities can help protect players from injury as well. So here's work from Shane Malone in terms of improved strength, speed, and repeated sprint qualities in players can help, is associated with improved odds for injury. Now, again, this is a paper that was done with amateur hurling. So another example of how we can use ideas, research, and findings from other sports, other team sports. We have to maintain that knowledge of the context, that it may not be exactly the same as our environment, but it may be useful as well. And then I like to think of this performance cycle, you know, regardless of if you're dealing with one game a week or you're dealing with 3 or 4 games a week, all of our athletes are undergoing this preparation phase into whatever their competition is, followed by recovery. And along the way here are some ideas where practitioners can hopefully assist with this process. Again, this itself is not sport specific. Obviously, as we drill down, we have to acknowledge and appreciate the context. And then I think as well, to take a step back from the actual nuance of performance, I think we have a role in terms of supporting the culture that the coach is trying to impart. We have roles in terms of belief effects for our athletes, motivation, confidence, and all these other pieces as well that we talk about less. But I've used this quote in the past, and I think obviously given recent events as well with Kobe Bryant, it's very pertinent to continue using it. But I guess from my experiences of changing environments and changing sports, it's really showed me about understanding the journey of others, whether that's the practitioners you're working with, the players you're working with, particularly going into a new sport. You know, we say we have two ears and one mouth for a reason, and certainly when you first go into an environment, listening to those around you and trying to learn the stories, learn the culture, learn the traditions of the sport before diving in and just trying to bring the system that you were using before is really important. So right on cue, in line. Again, Steve, I'm really pleased we were able to join in with that. Just to say that, you know, as we all know, as a world, we are facing something unprecedented for our generation. And thank you for putting this on, Steve. And likewise, hopefully everyone is doing their bit by staying at home and stopping the spread as well. And thank you for listening.
So thanks again for that, Joe. Really appreciate your time and commitment. I know it's been a tough few couple of days for you, so really appreciate your time.